If you are in the service industries, hospitality, or any other service-related industry, I think you're going to find this really interesting. So about 30 years ago, a group of researchers in Harvard asked themselves a really interesting question. They asked themselves, if we examine all sorts of different service businesses across the line and compare them, and if we take the best ones, let's say we take the 2-3 top performers in each category, hospitals, car rental, restaurants, insurance companies, whatever, and we isolate the best performers, and then we try and compare what it is that they're doing, is it then possible to extract some kind of a common denominator? And interestingly, the answer is yes, exactly. And that's what they found. And they published that in the Monster book. And there's a way that they approach their whole business, and that is what makes them successful. And so you may be thinking, well, 30 years ago, is that still relevant? And so what I want to share with you today is I think it's more relevant than it's ever been before. And the reason it is so relevant is because there are 3 major mega trends that are in the process of transforming the service industry. Powerful. And I call them abundance, service dominant logic, and the lack of engagement. So let's start with abundance. So abundance is this notion that we have got to a point in society where there really is too much of everything, if you think about it. We've moved since Second World War from scarcity to a situation now where there's too much of everything. Too many brands of cars, too many brands of computers, too many consultants, too many restaurants, and it generally tends to follow the same sort of pattern. There is a certain demand that is identified, and once the demand is identified, then somebody moves in and starts supplying it, and very soon everybody else piles in, and we have a situation where supply vastly exceeds demand. And then twice now we have experienced that this demand curve actually also takes a drop. We experienced it in 2008 with the financial crisis, which is when I really started seeing a pickup in interest for this concept of the service profit chain. That was the first time. And now I'm seeing it again now that we have the pandemic, because we're experiencing the same drop-off. And we have this drop-off in demand. We suddenly get a huge gap between supply and demand. And we have a huge gap between supply and demand. We call that hyper-competition. And in a hyper-competitive market, you are bombarded by messages from people who are trying to get you to buy their stuff or get your attention or whatever it is. Buy my tomatoes, no, buy my tomatoes. On and on it goes. Probably about 3,000 messages a day is what you get. Did you notice? No, of course you didn't, because what you do, you tend to ignore them completely. So in that sense, we've reached a stage in society now where it's never been easier to communicate, and it's never been more difficult to get heard, because you just get drowned out. And in that sense, we've suddenly got to a stage then where word of mouth becomes the decisive factor. When we look at what do successful service businesses have in common, they have a very high degree of customer loyalty, and that customer loyalty produces positive word of mouth. So that's the first thing we need to keep in mind. We need to focus on customer loyalty. Secondly, we also need to look at this other trend that is now changing the landscape around us, and it's what we call service dominant logic. So in that sense, we've been used to, for the past, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 years, whatever it is, we've had an economy that was based on value in exchange. I build this or make this, and then I sell it to you, and you take ownership of whatever it is, and I take your money. And that's how value is created, or has been created, for years and years and years. And we've been used to thinking it that way. What's happening now is that value is now being created in use. I think up some software, or I have something that I think you could need, but maybe just for a short period of time. And so I rent it to you, or I perform that service for you, and you pay me for my time or the service or whatever it is. And so there's a shift in that sense from, we've been very used to thinking in product specification. You want to buy a new car, you look at how many horsepowers do you have, does it have 4 doors or 5 doors, and all these kinds of specification. And when we move over into this notion of service, it becomes all about need. It becomes not about the product, but it becomes all about the customer. And what is the customer's need in that situation? And so in this situation where society is shifting into service mode, we're seeing all sorts of industries now getting on the bandwagon and transforming the way they do business, their whole business model, from a product delivery model to a service delivery model. And we're seeing it in cars, and we're seeing it in software, and we're seeing it all over the place, this move from actually taking ownership to having some kind of a service provided. And what is interesting in this whole thing is that because these new, or should we say old companies, are moving into a service world, they are also now reconfiguring service, and they're thinking service in a completely different way. This move into service dominant logic is that from a traditional service provider's perspective, what you have to wake up and realize is that the service levels are changing around you. The bar is rising, and new companies are moving into service, and they are reconfiguring and reinventing and changing the customer's expectation as to what they require from a service company. And that puts the pressure on the traditional service companies. And finally, the third mega trend, which is possibly from my point of view the most dramatic actually of all of them, is that we have now started registering on a systematic basis across industries, across regions, this lack of engagement in the workforce. Gallup documents it every year in their big engagement survey. The percentages vary a little bit from one region to the next across certain regions, but in its essence, it is the same message across the world. And the message is that about 60% of our workforce is not particularly engaged in what they do. So what does that mean? Well, it means that they come to work on Monday and they go, oh, another day at work, and they sort of, they do what they're supposed to do, and with a little sort of nudging and encouragement, they may sort of get around to it. It's all about compliance. There's no enthusiasm, there's no energy in it, and they don't really start sort of to pick up in energy till about Thursday afternoon, where they will smile a little bit, and Friday they come in with a big smile on their mouth, and then they start talking about all the fantastic and exciting things they're going to be doing during the weekend. And that's where they're putting their energy. And that's just not good enough. Add to that, we have about 24% who are actively disengaged in their job. They talk crap about their employer, they hate the customers, they hate the product, and it's a catastrophe because they really sabotage what we're trying to do. And then what's left is we have a piffling 13% who are actually documented as engaged in what they do. And that is an absolute catastrophe. And that is something we have to do something about, because the customer, the difference between a truly engaged service employee and an employee who just has a job is like incredible. It's chalk and cheese. And so we've got to find a way to increase the engagement. We've got to get rid of the 24%. They need to go over to the competition. And then we need to take at least half of the 63% and convert them into engaged. First, I have a question for you. What do you think actually affects you the most? What do you see of these three trends? The hyper-competitive environment, this raising of the bar of more and more services around you, or the lack of engagement? What do you think is affecting your business the most? So how do we develop loyalty and word of mouth? How do we understand what it takes to provide a service that is better than what everybody else is doing? You don't need to be perfect in this world, but you definitely need to be better than the rest. And how do we finally develop engagement in our workforce? All of these three things, I can show you how the service profit chain will help you solve. So I look forward to having a chance to explain to you in full and unfold what it actually means to implement the whole thinking of the service profit chain in your organization. Give me a call. Let's have a chat about it.